Quad66. All right, got a couple of new tunes for you, a couple of presets. So these are for the touring quad. So what I like to do is whenever I introduce a frame, I try and give you some sample builds and then develop some good tunes for you to use so that I know if you buy one of my frames that you're going to have something that flies pretty well, as long as you don't get too far away from the things that I've done here. Now, if you don't know how to use presets, I've got a link to a video below, but it's pretty simple in terms of just throwing in my GitHub URL, add my branch, and you add that as a resource. And then once you have that in there, you can just filter for Quad66, and that'll pull up all the stuff you need. So now, I've done these tunes specific. I developed them on my specific builds, but you can also go through the build and think about the all-up weight and think about the powertrain you're using. And if it's going to be pretty close on those two factors, you're probably going to be able to go ahead and pick these presets and use them on builds that are fairly similar to what I'm using, even if you're not flying my frames in particular. But the two tunes I have is, the first one I'm going to go through is, this is a build that's very specific for me. So this is trying to use, it's a little bit toned down to be able to fly this quad in smaller spaces, and so I'm flying the FPV cycle motors with the higher KV at 6,350 KV, but I'm flying them on 2S. So overall, if you multiply that out, 2S times the KV, you're kind of in that 12,700 range, versus if you go and get what I call, this is more like a typical 3S, and although I developed this at 2S because I'm using higher KV, if you think about, most of the times we're either flying 1204 or 13 millimeter and probably about a 5,000, 5,500 KV. And so if you're on 3S, that gets you to about 15,000 KV, and that's going to be pretty close to what I'm doing here with 2S with 8,000 KV. So if you multiply that out, that's like 16,000 KV. So this is sort of my equivalent of, this should work for your 3S build, versus this is a little bit unique with the 2S build. There's going to be some differences in that, in the PIDs and the tune that you need there. Now, before you apply these, I put in a lot of information of things that you need to think about. I'm not going through all the stuff that I have before. There will be links down below also, like if you have an F411 board, what are all the settings you need to do to optimize that? I'm going to assume that you know how to do this and you're good to go and you can just pick this and apply it. So I'm not going to go through the details there. Now, if you are not flying my frames and you want to think about if this is going to work for you, really think about, are you flying 2S or 3S? What's your all-up weight? What's your powertrain? And then if it's close, it should work. Now, diving into this one, this is pretty wild. So this is that lower power build. And you can see, especially with those 30-20 props, I had to get after these PIDs. These PIDs are high. I mean, look at that. Your P is above 100. Your D is in the 70 to 80 range. These are pretty high PIDs, and that's just what it took to get the quad flying well. I'm also using more thrust linearization than I have on my previous kind of 2 to 3S. This is more like getting into the range that I use typically for 1S, where I'm using 40% thrust linearization. Another thing to think about too is the dynamic idle. This is at 39. What the balance here is, the tighter the tune, if you want the kind of more of a racy feel to the quad, you can push this up. The downside of turning this up is you're going to lose inverted hang time. So if you're more flying freestyle and you really want to huck and throw it as far as you can, you want to turn down the dynamic idle. But that's just going to make it more challenging for the quad to keep up in terms of how tight your set point tracking is going to be. So other points to note is that, so with these PIDs where they're at, I wanted to get these sliders kind of in a nice middle range for you in general where I could, so that you've got room to move these up and down. And after we go through the tunes, I'm going to show you some black box logs and show you kind of where you might want to adjust these a little bit. And we'll talk about some of the reasons you might want to do that. But the master multiplier, you got some room to push up and down. So if you want to tighten up the tune, you turn up the master slider. If you get some P oscillations, you might want to turn that down. But there's plenty of room to move the sliders in all cases. The other thing that you got to consider too is that this all works together as a package. The tune works with the filtering. And so one of the things that I have updated here now is that I've separated out my filtering strategy if you've got an MPU 6000 gyro versus if you have a BMI 270 gyro. Both of these cases I'm using RPM filtering, so the other part you got to think about is, like, do you have a 12 pole, 14 pole motor, and adjust that accordingly. I haven't figured out, so there's so many like kind of overlapping things that there's no way for me to like make this work for everything. So I'm just kind of trying to put more information up there to keep people out of trouble so they don't try and stick this on a 14 pole motor. In terms of the filtering, so why do these work together? Well, when we are pushing our PID gains this high, we've got to make sure that we don't have so much latency in the filters that the oscillations become a problem. We also have to make sure that we don't have so much noise that the D gains don't become too much of a problem. And so these really work hand in hand. With that said, my filter setting is pretty darn aggressive. So this is on the BMI 270 gyro. I've got this gyro low pass completely off. The D term is slid all the way as aggressive as you can to 2. And then I'm doing some things that are just a little bit different with RPM filtering. So based on how the BMI gyro filters its internal filter, I'm not seeing that you need a third harmonic on the RPM filter, so I'm cutting that down to save a little bit of latency. But it needs some help in the middle range of the noise, and that's where the dynamic notch comes in. I'm adding an extra one, so rather than 1, I'm putting 2. This is a little bit different from my strategy with the MPU 6000, where the MPU 6000 can use a little help up high. So I keep one of the low pass on for the MPU 6000, and I have 3 harmonics on the RPM and only 1 harmonic on the notch filter. Versus default, the other thing I'm doing here is pushing up that max frequency up to 800 to make sure that we cover our big chunk of noise in the middle. And the Q factor, I think the Q factor actually, I think they've moved the default up. It used to be like, I could be wrong on this, but I think it used to be a narrower Q factor, higher numbers are narrow, so 500, less latency. But on these D-term notch filters, I just find because they're reactive, you need a wide enough notch to actually get to the noise in time to actually do something about it, and so that's why I'm using 300. And so as I said, on the BMI, we're doing some things to take down the latency. We're getting rid of that gyro low pass. We're taking off one of the harmonics on the RPM filter, but we're kind of putting back in a little latency to control the noise in the mid-range with the extra dynamic notch. A couple of things you need to do or happen, a couple things that happen with these under the hood, and I'll show you that to you. One of them is the PID sum limit. It's got to be pretty high, so we're bumping up the PID sum limit up to 1000 because how high her PID gains are. Otherwise, you'd probably be running into that that default at 500 potentially. And then the RPM, the filter Q on the RPM, we're tightening that up. I didn't see a lot of benefit, and this is unchanged from previous videos I've done or previous filter things I've talked to you about. Narrowing down the filters to the Q is 750 rather than the default of 500. I find that the 750 is good enough, and we're trying to, we're trying to get that balanced thing where we need these things to work together. We need to minimize the latency, and I think the trade-off there is 750 works better. All right, so that is, I think, the details on my sort of lower power build. So let's go ahead and change this out, and I'll show you the higher power build. And I think this one might be actually a little bit more common, and it also looks a little bit more typical compared to that lower power build. So in this case, let me pull these back up. So in this case, This is going to be kind of that equivalent of the 3S build. Granted, I built it up on the 1204s with 8000 kV and flew it with 2S, but I used a big 2S battery. I used like a 720. If you want to use this, get down to this weight. So this is 104 gram all up weight. Not all that much heavier, honestly, than the other build. Only a few grams, but I'm using the 720s. To get down to this weight on 3S, you're going to have to use the pretty small batteries, like 450, 500 size. How this looks. So this looks a little bit more typical, but it's still pretty darn aggressive. I just found with the extra weight with the HDZero system, I just had to push the PIDs a little bit higher to get the set point tracking. So you can see not quite as crazy as 100, but we're still upper 70s, low 80s on the P. That's still pretty high for this type of build. You can see the Ds are pretty high, 56, 64, and the feed forwards, goes along with that. I did the same thing on a thrust linearization here at 40%. The dynamic idle is kind of my default for this size at 39. And like the other tune, I'm giving you plenty of room to move that master multiplier around if you need to adjust things. And the filter on this one, this is also a BMI 270, so this particular filter is no different than the quad I just went through. So I don't think I have to really dive down into that. Similarly, under the hood, if you went into your CLI, you'd see the PID sum limit at 1000. You'd also see the RPM Q at 750. And so overall, a lot of things are very similar. It's just basically what I did for this tune is just pretty much just back down the master slider is really the main difference between the two tunes. All right, so let's dive into some logs now, and I'll show you how they perform, and we'll talk about a little bit of like some of the compromises here. So the first one here that I'm showing you, this is that this is my 13mm build. It's my lower power build, and this is on the 3020 props. In terms of our snap roll, what we want to see is that the gyro, so this is the line in red, follows the set point, which is the line in yellow. And you can see on our snap roll, we're doing really well here. We're jumping on the set point really quickly, not doing any bad oscillations, not overshooting, not undershooting. And on the back side, even the more challenging side, we're holding tight pretty well. In terms of the little twitch moves, let's scroll down to these and find some twitch moves. So these are little moves back and forth. And this is where we're going to have some trade-offs here. There's a little bit of balance here. What you can see is, if you look at the red, the gyro, at the top of these twitch moves, this isn't quite hanging on quite as well as what I would describe as ideal. And the reason I settled here rather than continuing pushing things up is because we have to balance two other factors. One of those factors is just the noise, and we'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. The other factor is P oscillations. So you can see them starting to come in here. So this is a full throttle punch out. If you look at the motors, we're pretty much close to maxed out. So what I'm doing here is I'm just ramping up the motors and giving us a full punch out. And what we're looking for here is on full throttle, do we have too much P? Are we starting to get a little oscillation? And when you look really closely, you can see it. And probably just as much as seeing it, you can hear it. So this is like when you roll into that full punch out, does it sound nice and clean, or does it sound like a little warbly sound? And so the balance that I found is that if I prioritize this further, I can keep pushing this up and get this tighter, but then I really start to bring out this P oscillation. And to me, for the way I fly, this is the balance I like. I like when I'm getting into very full throttle, I'm okay with a little bit of warbling. I don't spend much time at full throttle, so I'm okay with this. It doesn't really bother me much. And I'd rather have the better tracking on these twitch moves. So that's the way I'm erring here a little bit. Now, if you go to the 3018 prop, so this is on the 3020 tri-blades, which is actually my preferred prop here. This is a heavier, harder to swing prop, and if you go to the 3018, which is also a very good choice here, this P oscillation can actually be a little bit more problematic. So I didn't adjust this tune for the 3018, so if you're going to fly the 3018s, you might want to just back off that master slider a little bit. So if this P oscillation at full punch outs is bothering you too much, you might want to back down that master slider a little bit. And if you have to back it down a lot, you might want to start pushing up the thrust linearization, which is going to give you a little bit more control on the twitch moves without getting into as much. Basically gives you a little bit more PID earlier on in the thrust curve, and that may help you out. But overall, with this same exact tune, if this little oscillation here isn't bothering you on the 3018s, you know, you could use this tune as is, because set point tracking on your snap roll looks great. And then if you look at your twitch moves, let's get to the twitch moves here. Let's get to there. You can see that the set point tracking on twitch moves on the 3018 is actually probably just a little bit better than what we're seeing on the 3020s. And that kind of makes sense because we have an easier to swing prop. It's a little bit easier for this slightly underpowered build to really control that prop. And also, relatively speaking, this one, relatively speaking, the PIDs are higher because you can see we're getting more oscillation on our full punch out. So then the other thing we want to balance, obviously, is our noise. There's a lot of D-gain going on here, so it's not surprising that we have a fair bit of noise. And you can see this is a classic BMI 270 look, where you can see once the internal filtering really kicks in, the BMI 270 is really clean up high. So when we look at the noise profile, the things that I'm not seeing, so on the BMI 270 gyro, let's go to gyro scaled. So with the BMI 270 gyros, it's often pretty easy to see the primary motor band. So this is your motor band here. This is kind of your main frame resonance here. And what you don't see is multiple bands. So if we start pushing up this brightness here, you know, you're hardly even really seeing much of the second harmonic, and definitely nothing of the third harmonic. That's why I just don't really see a third harmonic here much at all. So that's why I take off that third harmonic of from the RPM filter, and I focus more on this middle section. And that's where what I find is that the extra dynamic notch helps me out. So what we're doing is that dynamic notch filter, it's active in this area, and so throwing two of those in helps with this stuff here, which is where, for whatever reason, to me the BMI 270 gyro just kind of struggles there compared to the MPU 6000. So usually with the BMI 270 you find less noise down here on the low end, you find more noise here, and then again low noise versus the MPU 6000. That's why we have that slightly different filtering strategy. So talked about some of those things there. So now let's look at the more powerful build here. So this is with that, so in my case I'm flying on 2S, but it's really kind of the equivalent of 3S for most people. And this is with the 3018 prop. I think that's going to be probably the more common prop when, so I'm thinking with this build you're flying it in bigger spaces, and the 3018 prop might be a little bit more common in that type of situation. But you can see our set point tracking is great. That gyro jumps right on the set point, doesn't do any weird oscillations, comes right back down with it. And also when we look at, let's get to some twitch moves here, it's really tracking those twitch moves very nicely. You can see how it's hanging on there quite well. Now, just like I showed you on the lower power build, you might be getting into some oscillations here. So I tuned this, I developed this tune on the 3020s. And so what I'm noticing with the 3020s is they have less problems with this P oscillation, and they struggle more with the twitch moves. So with the 3018 prop, if this P oscillation on full punch out is bothering you, like I mentioned before on the other build, you might want to push the master slider down. And then if you need to, if you have to push the master slider down a lot, you might want to push up that thrust linearization. But overall, you know, we've got good set point tracking on both the you know, the snap rolls, snap flips, as well as with our twitch moves. Noise-wise, because, so this is on, this is our D. Because we're using less D, we just amplify less noise. So this is actually a little bit easier to manage. But interestingly enough, although like with black box tuning, we focus a lot on the graphs, it's important to check your motors, because I manipulated this a little bit, but I think I got this back to where it is. But if you look at the color here, see how on, this is on those 13mm motors with the amount of D that we're running, see how we're getting it a little bit on these peaks. It's going out of the green and into that sort of orange band here. Versus on the lower D over here, we're really not getting into the orange band. This is all staying in the green. What's interesting about this is, although this noise-wise looks better, in the air, these motors are actually getting warmer than the FPV cycle motors. So this motor, the 13mm motor on 2S, and I'm not sure how much of that is going to be the motor with the wider stator versus 2S versus 3S, but the important thing here is you always want to correlate what you see with the graphs with what the quad is doing in the air. And so this actually runs cooler, even though it looks noisier. This runs cooler than this cleaner looking trace here. All right, so that's what I have for these tunes for you. I think they fly pretty darn well. I think you can kind of pick your battles in here and tune them up a little bit more to your preference, but you should be really, really close. If your quad has a similar power, similar weight, this should really get you close to where you want to be. So questions, ask questions down below. Check out my presets. If you're looking for other things in terms of tunes and builds, you know, feel free to ask questions. Maybe we can do some follow-up videos. All right. Till next time, cheers.